Viridian, The Green Guide, written by Clouds, read by Distracted by Books, Chapter 53, Hidden. Eraser hadn't wanted him to leave. Izuku could tell. It was only logical, so he didn't want to blame him, but it was still kind of annoying to have to focus on being stealthy and losing a tail when all he wanted to do was fall into bed and never wake up. Finally, after using every bit of stealth he'd picked up from spending nights around heroes, Izuku managed to get rid of that weird tingle in his spine that said he was being watched and was able to go home. He crawled in his window and barely had the energy to shed his weapons and switch his jeans out with PJs before he collapsed into the bed. Izuku distantly realized that he should probably take off the stupid hoodie that Amplifier had given him. But he was tired, and it was comfy. It wasn't his usual hoodie, so it wasn't like he actually had to worry about anyone seeing it and realizing he was Viridian, right? There was another part of him buried deep at the moment that was screaming as loud as it could that those were all just excuses, and that the real reason he didn't want to take off the hoodie was because it was a physical reminder that there were people that would miss him if he died. Izuku didn't let himself listen to that part. If he did, he knew he'd just feel guilty because he didn't deserve to be wrapped in a hoodie hug from one of his favorite heroes. So he chose not to overthink it, instead giving into the bone-deep exhaustion and pretending that everything would be better in the morning. Shoto really needed a drink, but the sun was barely even up, so having alcohol in his system right now would be the height of irrationality. Still, didn't mean that he wanted to deal with any of the paperwork from last night. At least they were almost done. It was one of the only positives of the whole situation. It had killed him to let Viridian leave like that, but he trusted the kid. He knew he wasn't going to break his promise, which meant that they had at least another day where the kid would be safe, and then they could deal with everything. Add that to the fact that Ishoto was the one who first discovered the body and needed to be on site when the police arrived, and it basically led to the perfect storm, leading to him, a licensed hero, letting a suicidal kid known to be relapsing walk away alone. He hated it. Shota sighed in exhaustion as he signed the final page. Maybe he should get Nedzu to help him track the kid down. It seemed like a betrayal of trust, but if it would keep the kid safe, then his thoughts were interrupted by a kid in a middle school uniform pushing open the front doors of the police station with a tad more force than was strictly necessary. The kid slouched up to the front desk where Sansa was sitting, hands deep in his pockets, and Shoto would almost be tempted to think the kid was worried about something if he wasn't acting like such an obvious delinquent. Yo, furball. The kid grumbled, Amplifier anywhere around here? Shota's eyes almost widened with surprise, but he was dealing with a teenager, so it was only logical to expect the unexpected. Still, a kid with enough delinquent tendencies to call a cop furball walking straight into a police station and asking for a specific hero? Maybe he was just eager for a distraction, but it made him curious, which was how he found himself approaching the desk. She had to run to the restroom real quick. Shota volunteered. She should be back in a minute. The kid looked him up and down, looking unimpressed. What are you supposed to be, a hobo? Shota scoffed. Try a hero, kid. The kid raised an eyebrow at him. Seriously? How do you ever expect to get popular if you dress like that? Not every hero has to be popular, kid. Shota huffed. Some of us don't like dealing with the vultures. Oh. Shota almost rolled his eyes. Apparently no one had ever told the kid that before. It was one of his least favorite things about the hero industry, that push toward popularity. It led to kids like this who just didn't know that underground heroics were an option. It was frustrating, but if Shota had the power to change it, he would have already done so. They waited in somewhat awkward silence for a moment before the kid spoke up again. So if you're a frickin' hero, what's your name? Eraserhead. Shota said his hero name like it was a challenge because in a lot of ways it was. It was rare that even the students in his class had even heard his name, much less random punk kids who walked in off the streets, but he supposed there was always a first for everything. The kid apparently heard the challenge in his voice because he glared at Shota for a long moment as he tried to place and then scoffed, "That's a stupid name." "Yep." His blunt answer made the kid laugh, and Shota's eyes nearly widened in surprise. With, well, everything. He'd been expecting the kid's laugh to sound cruel like a bully's, but it just sounded tired. In fact, it was more similar to one of Shota's rare chuckles than what he'd expected based on how the kid presented himself. The kid hesitated. "This kid I used to know. He probably would have known about you. Probably could rattle off a dozen facts about you too." Shota was about to deny this because he was underground for a reason, but they were interrupted. "Wait, was that a laugh from the great Koski Bakugo?" Amplifier's voice called from behind them in exaggerated shock, and Shota turned, rolling his eyes when he realized she was clutching at her chest dramatically. "Did you break him, Eraser?" "Shut up, loud bitch," the kid, Bakugo apparently, said good-naturedly. That just made Amplifier laugh, which, even though it was annoyingly loud, Shota was oddly grateful for. After everything that had happened that morning, they could all use a little distraction. He looked more carefully at the kid. Amplifier seemed to take his rudeness and swearing in stride, and there didn't seem to be any malice behind it, so maybe the kid wasn't as much of a delinquent as he seemed. Either way, he was still a punk. "Ah, Eraserhead, how rude of me not to introduce you to." Amplifier grinned. "This is Bakugo. I think I told you about him. The kid who volunteers with my villain redemption group." Shota did remember. So this was the kid who was self-aware enough to realize he needed to make changes before he could be a hero, and was willing to take steps to make that happen. It made his behavior make a lot more sense. He was a delinquent, or at least he had been, and now probably didn't know any other way to act. He could probably use a little more work, especially if he wanted to be a popular hero, but the base was there. "To what do I owe this visit?" Amplifier asked. "Shouldn't you be in school?" "Doesn't start for another 20 minutes. Bakugo grumbled. "And I needed to talk to you about something." "All right." Amplifier shrugged, clearly conveying that it wasn't the weirdest thing that had happened all day. "Shoot." Bakugo shot a look at Shota, probably wanting a little bit of privacy, and Shota was about to honor the kid's wishes and walk away when he bit the bullet and just started talking. "You ever heard of some guy who calls himself Stain?" Shota and Amplifier shared a look. Was Bakugo really asking about the hero killer? How had he even heard that name? They'd been working to keep it out of the media as much as possible. "Big guy," Bakugo prompted. "Katana, way too many knives, stupid paralyzation quirk when he cuts you, manic obsession with heroes being worthy." How did he know so much? Shota knew Stain's quirk had been written about before, but his motivations were still largely unknown, even to those investigating him. So how? "Well, if you don't know about him, you should." Bakugo ran his hand through his hair and huffed in frustration and embarrassment. "He's freaking insane." "You sound like you're speaking from experience," Shota said slowly. Bakugo looked at him like he was an idiot. "No, I just saw him on a billboard. Of course I'm speaking from experience. He frickin' tried to kill me." Shota and Amplifier both froze. Even back when he'd been Stendhal, Stain had been known to go after anyone he had an issue with, and while it was rare for him to go after kids, it wasn't unheard of. Which brought up the question of how this kid survived the encounter. "But Bakugo," Amplifier hesitated, "Stain usually goes after heroes or villains. You're not either, so he thought he'd nip me in the bud before I could become a hero," Bakugo snarled. "I'm not an idiot. I know how I act. And before you ask, he changed his frickin' mind and decided to spare me. Let me grow or some shit." Shota raised an eyebrow curiously. "Do you know why?" Now he was sure that the kid was embarrassed. Bakugo looked at the floor. Guy's freaking insane. Nothing he does makes sense. Shota looked at Amplifier and they silently agreed not to press him for answers. Yet. Amplifier placed a hand on Bakugo's arm and spoke softly. When was this? Couple of nights ago. Bakugo grumbled. Shota crossed his arms. And you didn't tell us then because I thought I could frickin' handle it, Bakugo snapped. I'm gonna be a hero. I need to be strong and rely on others. Amplifier said firmly, I know we've talked about this in group, but you don't have to do everything alone, Bakugo, and you shouldn't. Whatever. Bakugo adjusted his backpack and kept glaring at the floor. I've got to get to class. Just don't let that guy Stain corner you. He looked him in the eye before he turned to leave. He's frickin' terrifying. Inko knew that Izuku's sleep schedule was messed up. Ever since switching to online school, he mostly slept at odd hours, and she had a sneaking suspicion that he had several hours in the early morning that he did homework instead of sleeping. But there were days like today when she wondered if there was something else going on. Izuku hadn't left his room all day, which was odd, especially because it was her day off and he usually at least came to eat dinner with her. His light wasn't even on, and she couldn't see the light from his laptop, so she knew he wasn't just getting distracted with his classes, which meant he was still in bed. She knocked a few times before pushing his door open hesitantly. Izuku, baby, are you okay? Izuku was curled up in his bed facing the wall, but he hadn't been asleep. When she came in, he looked back at her and sat up quickly, giving her a bright smile that was obviously fake, considering that she could still see the puffy eyes and tear tracks that meant he'd been crying. Her heart clenched slightly. She knew the rates of depression in teens and how those risks were increased in the quirkless, and she'd hoped that things would get better for Izuku after transferring out of Aldera, but apparently she'd been wrong. Or maybe it was just a bad day. She hoped to God it was just a bad day. She smiled awkwardly, hesitant to address the elephant in the room. Izuku would tell her if something was wrong, right? I've never seen that hoodie before. Is it new? Eraserhead's one of the heroes you like, right? I remember you mentioning him when you were a bit younger. Oh! Izuku looked down to see what he was wearing and turned bright red. Yeah, it's, custom merch. Yeah, custom merch. I just, really like him. Inko didn't really know how to respond to that. Izuku liked a lot of heroes. But this Eraserhead must really be something special if he was willing to spend his money on custom merch of the hero. Still, talking about the hoodie had given her an idea. Izuku was probably afraid of worrying her. He had always been a considerate child, quick to wipe away his tears if it meant he could comfort someone else who was crying. If he was in pain, he probably wouldn't tell anyone. He would just keep it to himself, so he'd be the only one suffering. But that brief moment talking about the hoodie, it had distracted him. So even if Inko couldn't force him to tell her what was wrong, the least she could do is distract him from whatever was bothering him until he felt a little better. The first step would be getting him out of his dark room. I was just about to make a batch of cookies. Inko smiled. I thought I'd take them to my coworker. You know, the one who was injured during the New Year's disaster? An unreadable expression crossed Izuku's face, but it was quickly replaced with a smile. That sounds like a great idea, Mom. She actually has a daughter around your age, Inko said carefully. I thought maybe you'd like to come help me deliver them? Again, the same expression passed over his face, and Izuku looked briefly torn before he took a look at Inko's puppy dog eyes and grumbled, All right. Inko smiled and pulled Izuku out of bed. Good. Now, I was thinking chocolate chip, but maybe with their family's quirks, we might want to add some extra ingredients. End of chapter.